The relentless drought had transformed the New Mexico territory into a vast, desolate wasteland of shattered hopes. For Silvara Riversgate, the arid ground covering her husband's grave served as yet another stark reminder that compassion exacted a toll she could no longer bear. With just one aging horse and a dry, empty well, the widow had ceased hoping for rain. But on that fateful night, when an injured Apache warrior fell at her fence, she surrendered her final means of survival, unaware that by morning the quiet valley would resonate with the pounding hooves of 30 untamed mustangs, a recompense for an act of kindness that would forever alter the territory's fate. The sun's heat danced across the fissured earth of Salvation Valley, a name that had become a bitter joke to the handful of resilient individuals who still resided there. The year was 1887, and the territory had not seen substantial rainfall in a year and a half. The afternoon sun scorched the worn timber of Silvara Riversgate's homestead, the sole building for miles amidst the desolate expanse. At 42, Silvara had outlived both her husband and the aspirations that had led them westward from Pennsylvania 7 years prior. She stood at the boundary of her land, one hand shielding her eyes from the unyielding sun, observing as Larson, her last remaining horse, aimlessly pawed at the ground. The once proud Appaloosa had grown gaunt, his ribs protruding beneath a lackluster coat that had lost its sheen months ago. Like everything else on the homestead, he was gradually fading away. "Just a bit longer, old friend," Silvara whispered, her rough hand stroking his neck. The marshal vowed that supply wagons would arrive by week's end, but pledges held little weight in this forsaken land. 4 months earlier, when Gareth had succumbed to the fever ravaging the isolated homesteads, the neighbors had pledged to look in on her. None had returned after the burial. 3 weeks prior, the last family on the adjacent property had loaded their wagon before dawn and vanished eastward without a word of goodbye. Silvara held no grudges against them. Only a fool or a widow with no other options would linger in this limbo between society and the wilderness. Inside the cabin, the temperature offered little respite. Silvara moved deliberately, conserving her strength as she readied her evening repast. A thin stew crafted from her last preserved vegetables and a handful of dried beans. No meat tonight. No meat for nearly 2 weeks now. Larson was too precious for hunting forays into the foothills, where game might still roam. As she stirred the modest broth, her eyes wandered to Gareth's rifle, mounted above the door, loaded and at the ready, just as he had always kept it. Beside the portrait, a faded photograph captured their wedding day. She struggled to recognize the hopeful young woman in the image, her dark hair elegantly styled under a lace veil, eyes sparkling with anticipation. "You always promised the rains would return," she whispered to the vacant room. "I'm still waiting, Gareth." The sound of her own voice startled her. She spoke aloud less frequently these days, the valley's silence having permeated her very being. On some days, she wondered if she had forgotten how to string words together, becoming as silent as the arid landscape. The lone window faced west, providing a view of the sun's descent behind the far-off mesas. Silvara had once found the sunsets breathtaking, with crimson and gold hues painting the sandstone cliffs. Now each sunset signified another day of endurance, another night of loneliness, and another sunset bringing her closer to the decision she had been evading, to leave behind everything they had created and journey east to her sister's home in St. Louis. We see Gareth and Silvara arriving at the empty valley 7 years earlier, his face alight with dreams of the cattle ranch they would establish. The land agent had shown them maps of hidden springs, promising rich soil and mild temperatures. For 3 years, it had been true. Enough rain fell to cultivate crops. The small herd of cattle flourished, and they added a robust barn to the property. Gareth had been esteemed among the sparse settlers, known for his fair transactions and eagerness to assist newcomers. Silvara had cultivated a small orchard, selling apple preserves to passing wagon trains. They weren't wealthy, but they were creating something uniquely their own. Then the drought began, gradually at first, with just a drier-than-usual spring. Then a summer of clear skies. By the second year, the cattle had to be sold. The orchard trees wilted, and the neighboring homesteaders started to depart. Gareth grew more reserved, spending days riding the perimeter of their land, searching for any hint of moisture. The last time he had ventured out, he had returned with a fever. Silvara finished her stew, cleaning the bowl with a piece of hardtack that she had to soak before she could chew it. As night fell across the valley, she performed her nightly routine, checking the empty rain barrel, securing the cabin door, and ensuring Larson was safely in the small corral behind the house. The horse was all she had left of value, her means of transportation, potential emergency sustenance, and her sole companion in the desolation. "Water for 1 more day," she told the horse, pouring a meticulously measured amount into his trough. "Then we'll have to try the creek bed again." The creek was now little more than a faded memory, a dry gash in the earth where water had once flowed freely. But occasionally, if one dug deep enough in certain spots, a small amount of murky water would seep up from the underground aquifer, just enough for 1 woman and 1 horse to subsist on. Sleep came in fits that night, as it always did. The valley's silence was almost absolute, occasionally disrupted by the faint, distant howls of coyotes. Silvara rested on the narrow bed she had once shared with Gareth, listening to the wind as it forced its way through the cabin's cracks, carrying dust that blanketed every surface. The next day she would have to sweep again, a never-ending struggle against the advancing desert. It was close to midnight when Larson's agitated whinny roused her from sleep. Silvara sat up immediately, her frontier life having sharpened her instincts. The horse seldom made noise after dark. Something was amiss. She grabbed Gareth's rifle and moved silently to the window, gazing out into the moonlit yard. At first, she noticed nothing out of the ordinary. The corral gate was still closed, and Larson was pacing nervously inside. Then, a shadow shifted near the fence line. It wasn't the familiar, stealthy form of a coyote, but something larger, human. Her finger tightened on the trigger. Raiders were uncommon this far from the main trails, but hard times pushed men to do desperate things. She had heard tales from traveling merchants about homesteaders, stripped of their last supplies, women left alone and especially vulnerable. "Who's out there?" she called, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm armed, and I won't think twice about shooting." The figure lurched forward into a beam of moonlight, then crumpled heavily to the ground, not charging toward the house, not trying to breach the corral, just falling as if the last of their strength had finally abandoned them. Silvara waited, counting her heartbeats, watching for any movement. When none came, she lit a lantern, rifle still at the ready, and stepped cautiously onto the porch. The night air held the chill of autumn, a reminder that winter would soon bring its own hardships, on top of the drought. She moved slowly toward the fallen figure, lantern held high. As the light revealed the scene, her breath hitched. The man lay face down, one arm stretched toward the corral as if pleading for help. Even in the faint light, she could see he was Native American, his long black hair, bronze skin, and clothing identifying him as one of the Apache from the northern reservation. But it was the dark, spreading stain on his side that demanded her attention. Blood, fresh enough to glisten in the lantern light. Silvara paused. The relationship between settlers and the native tribes was complicated and often perilous. Gareth had maintained cautious but respectful interactions with the Apache, who sometimes passed through their land, trading goods and leaving each other in peace. But that was before the drought had driven everyone to desperation. The wounded man hadn't moved since falling. She could simply return to the cabin, secure the door, and wait until morning. If he survived the night, she could decide then what to do. If not, the issue would resolve itself. Returning to my tale, the sensible path was evident. However, as I pivoted to leave, the man emitted a faint sound. It wasn't quite a word, more of a soft groan, a mere breath of agony that pierced my resolve. I found myself crouching beside him, placing my rifle within arm's reach, but moving the lantern closer to inspect his injury. "Can you hear me?" I inquired, carefully rolling him onto his back. His face was youthful, younger than I had anticipated, likely no older than 30. He had high cheekbones and strong features, now contorted with pain. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, and his eyes remained shut. The wound in his side was a bullet hole, the edges torn and inflamed. It was not a recent injury, perhaps 2 days old, but it had been left untreated and was now infected. He required medicine, clean bandages, water we couldn't afford to spare, and food we didn't possess. Aiding him would deplete my own scarce supplies, accelerating the moment when I would have to forsake the homestead or meet my end alongside it. I sat back, the harsh realities of survival clashing with a deeper, more humane instinct that the unforgiving landscape had nearly erased. I gazed at the stranger's face again, and for an instant, I saw a faint echo of Gareth in his final, feverish days. I had been powerless then, watching my husband fade away despite my frantic efforts. "Blast it all," I murmured, my resolve solidified. With the strength forged from years of toil, I managed to drag and carry the unconscious man to the cabin. Inside, I laid him on the bare hide rug before the cold hearth, unwilling to let a stranger into my bed, but unable to abandon him. On the cold floor, I kindled a small fire using precious tinder and set water to boil. By the lantern's glow, I cut away the blood-soaked cloth around his wound and cleaned it as best I could. The man winced but didn't stir, his skin scorching with fever. Among Gareth's belongings, I found a bottle of whiskey, reserved for medicinal use, and used some to clean the wound before packing it with the last of my dried yarrow leaves. Throughout the night, I kept watch, occasionally trickling water between his parched lips, searching for any sign of improvement. By dawn, his breathing had slowed slightly, but the fever still held him in its grip. I stepped outside to tend to Larson, my eyes heavy with exhaustion. The eastern sky had begun to brighten, the stars dissolving into the pale blue that heralded sunrise. Another clear day, another day without rain. The horse whinnied softly as I approached, nudging my shoulder in greeting. I stroked his neck, my mind racing through my dwindling options. The injured man needed more care than I could provide. The nearest doctor was in Copper Springs, nearly 30 miles away, too far to walk in my weary state, carrying a wounded man. There was only one viable course of action. "Forgive me, old friend," I whispered to Larson. "I require your assistance one final time." She equipped the horse with Gareth's finest saddle, attaching a water skin and the meager rations she could spare to the saddlebags. Afterward, she went back to the cabin and somehow succeeded in getting the barely conscious Starhaven on his feet, guiding him, half walking and half dragging, to where Larson stood waiting. "Remain still," she instructed, though she was uncertain if he comprehended her. With great effort, she assisted him in mounting, then secured his hands to the saddle horn to prevent him from falling. The Apache's eyes opened briefly, revealing confusion and pain in their dark depths. "Copper Springs," Silvara articulated clearly, gesturing eastward. "Doctor, do you understand? Copper Springs." She was unsure if any of her words penetrated, but when she stepped back and urged Larson forward, the horse began moving steadily toward the eastern trail. The injured man swayed precariously, but stayed mounted, his body seemingly adapting to the horse's motion, even in his feverish state. Silvara stood in the yard, observing as her last link to Gareth, her final means of escape, and her sole companion vanished over the ridge with a stranger she would likely never encounter again. "Foolish woman," she muttered to herself, turning back to the now deserted cabin. Without Larson, she had roughly a week before she would need to depart on foot, assuming she could carry enough water to reach the next settlement. As the sun ascended, Silvara compelled herself to rest for a few hours, then spent the afternoon assessing her remaining provisions. According to her estimates, she had enough food for 5 days if she rationed carefully. Water, however, was the more pressing issue. Without Larson, she couldn't transport enough from the distant creek to last more than a day or two. When night fell, she found herself at the fence line where the Apache had collapsed, gazing east as if she might somehow glimpse what had become of horse and rider. Had they reached Copper Springs? Had the man succumbed to his injury along the way, leaving Larson without a rider and vulnerable to thieves or predators? Had she sacrificed her last lifeline in vain? "You would have done the same," she said aloud, as if Thomas could hear her reasoning. "You always maintain that we don't gauge the value of mercy by what it yields to us." But Gareth had uttered many words that the drought had disproven. As night enveloped the valley, Silvara retreated to the cabin and secured the door against the night and the growing conviction that she had just sealed her own destiny. She slept fitfully, her dreams filled with the sound of hoofbeats that always faded when she attempted to follow them. When the first faint light of dawn filtered through the window, she rose wearily, her body aching from the previous day's labors. She ignited a small fire, heated water for coffee made from reused grounds, and attempted to concentrate on practical concerns rather than remorse. The noise, when it finally reached her, was so soft that she wondered if she had merely imagined it. A distant growl akin to far-off thunder. Silvara halted, her coffee cup suspended mid-air. Thunder signified clouds, and clouds could bring rain. She rushed to the door and threw it wide open, her gaze sweeping the horizon for any sign of storm clouds. The sky, however, remained a clear, taunting blue. But the rumble persisted, growing louder and coming from the east. It was not thunder. It was the sound of hoofbeats. Many hoofbeats. Silvara shielded her eyes from the rising sun, watching as a plume of dust approached from the direction of Copper Springs. A rider emerged, outlined against the morning light, heading straight for the homestead at a steady pace. Behind him, another sight began to take shape, a moving mass that she could barely believe. Horses, dozens of them, wild mustangs in every color, blacks, bays, pintos, duns, streaming in formation behind the lead rider like a living river across the dry landscape. As the rider drew nearer, Silvara recognized the upright figure, no longer weakened but sitting tall in the saddle. The Apache warrior, mounted on Larson, was leading a herd of wild mustangs right to her doorstep. She stood still, shocked as they approached, the dust swirling around them like an answer to a prayer she had stopped uttering months ago. The mustangs circled the homestead once, their hooves kicking up clouds of dust that turned the morning air golden. Silvara stayed rooted to the spot, one hand clutching the doorframe for support, as the Apache warrior guided Larson right up to the front of the cabin. Up close, the change in him was even more striking. Though still lean, he sat tall and composed, with no sign of the fever that had gripped him just days before. He dismounted with ease, his hand briefly resting on Larson's neck in what seemed like gratitude. The horse looked better than when Silvara had sent him away, his coat shinier, his eyes brighter, as if he had been well cared for despite the journey. The Apache approached her slowly, stopping a respectful distance away. His dark eyes studied her face, neither threatening nor friendly, just observing. Up close, Silvara noticed that the wound in his side had been expertly treated, with fresh bandages visible beneath his leather vest. "You found the doctor," she said, breaking the silence. The man nodded once, then gestured toward the herd of mustangs that had settled into a loose formation behind him, some grazing on the sparse, dry grass, others watching with alert eyes. "For you," he said, his English accented but clear. "Payment for life." Silvara looked at him, then at the mustangs, at least 30 of them, each worth more than everything she owned. In this drought-stricken territory, horses meant transportation, labor, trade goods, survival. "I don't understand," she said. "I only gave you one horse." A hint of amusement flickered across his face. One horse, one life. He gently pressed a hand against the fresh bandage on his side. It was a fair exchange. Before she could react, he retrieved a small pouch from his belt and offered it to her. When she paused, he simply set it on the porch railing that separated them. "I am Nakorin," he introduced himself. "In my tongue, it signifies a skilled tracker." Silvara sent word. She responded automatically, still trying to make sense of the encounter. Nakorin acknowledged this with a nod, as if memorizing her name. He then gestured towards the horses. "They require water," he stated, glancing at her empty rain barrel before meeting her gaze again. Silvara followed his gaze to the herd, then back to the arid valley that surrounded them. In Salvation Valley, water was the most coveted resource, surpassing the value of gold or horses. The creek had run dry months ago, and the well barely yielded enough for one person and a single horse. 30 mustangs would demand gallons each day. "There's no water here," she declared, gesturing to the desolate landscape. "The creek has been dry since spring, and the wells are failing." "That's why everyone abandoned this place?" Nakorin's expression remained unchanged. "Not everyone," he replied, holding her gaze. "There is water deep within the earth," he explained, pointing towards the distant foothills that lay beyond her property. "I will guide you to it." Silvara had anticipated feeling exposed, riding a mustang instead of Larson's familiar steed. But the dun-colored mare Nakorin had chosen for her moved with an unexpected gentleness. She followed behind him, observing his upright posture, and the subtle way he directed his mount, as if horse and rider shared a single will. The herd fanned out behind and around them, flowing like a living tide across the valley floor. Some of the mustangs bore markings she had never seen before, unique patterns of white against dark coats, unusual dappling, and one with a coat so black it seemed to swallow the sunlight. "Where did they come from?" she inquired, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for nearly an hour. Nakorin indicated the northwest, where mountains loomed as mere blue shadows on the horizon. "Shadow Canyon," he said, "where Apache horses roam freely." "Did you capture all these yourself?" Silvara asked, unable to hide her skepticism. He shook his head. Not captured, he corrected. Invited. And before she could question this peculiar statement, he raised a hand, signaling a halt. They had reached a section of the foothills Silvara had never ventured into, a chaotic maze of rock formations that seemed impassable. Gareth had always insisted there was nothing of value beyond this point, that only the main valley was worth claiming. Nakoran dismounted and waited for her to do the same. He took a leather water skin from his horse and handed it to her. "Drink, then follow," he instructed. The water was cool and had a faint mineral taste. Silvara sipped it sparingly out of habit, then watched as Nakoran confidently approached what appeared to be an impenetrable rock wall. Only as he vanished between two massive rocks did she notice a concealed gap in the stone. She paused, her frontier upbringing making her cautious. She was isolated with a stranger, an Apache warrior whose motives were unclear, far from any human habitation. The prudent decision would have been to mount her horse and ride back to the homestead. But she had abandoned prudent decisions the instant she had invited a wounded man into her home in the dead of night. Silvara secured her horse's reins and ventured into the passage behind Nakoran. The trail snaked through towering rock walls, requiring her to turn sideways in the tightest sections. She could hear Nakoran's steady footsteps, but he was no longer within her line of sight. Just as the walls began to close in, the passage abruptly widened, revealing a hidden grotto. Silvara halted, astonished by the sight before her. A pool of clear water, roughly 30 feet across, was fed by a small waterfall cascading down the rock face. Lush greenery, unseen for months, thrived around the edges, defying the drought. The air here was different, cooler, damp, and vibrant. Nakoran stood at the water's edge, observing her reaction. "Water," he stated simply. "Hidden, yet ever-flowing. This place has been here all along." Silvara approached the water's edge, letting her fingers dip into the coolness. "How did you discover it?" she asked. "My people have known of it for generations. It is a sacred place." He knelt and filled a wooden cup from his pack, offering it to her. "Drink," he said. The water was unlike any she had tasted in Salvation Valley. It was sweet, cold, and free of the mineral taste of well water. It tasted like life itself. "Why reveal this place to me?" she asked. "Why not keep it hidden?" Nakoran pondered her question, his expression thoughtful. "You offered aid without hesitation, without knowing who I was." He gestured to the pool. "Water is like kindness. It should flow freely." They returned with leather bags filled with water from the hidden spring, enough to replenish Silvara's empty rain barrel and the water troughs that Nakoran had fashioned from half-barrels found in the abandoned barn. The mustangs drank eagerly, their presence transforming the desolate homestead into something resembling a functional ranch once more. As the sun began to set, Silvara found herself in the unusual position of preparing a meal for someone other than herself. She had added extra beans to the pot, along with the last of her dried corn. It wasn't much, but offering hospitality to the man who had brought this miracle of horses and water to her doorstep was the least she could do. "They'll need proper corrals," she said as she stirred the pot hanging over the fire, "if you plan for them to stay." Nakoran sat on the porch steps, carving something from a piece of wood with a small knife. He looked up at her words. "They are yours now. You decide if they stay." Silvara paused, the weight of his words sinking in. 30 mustangs. With these horses, she could restore everything, begin breeding stock, exchange some for cattle, and establish a ranch resilient enough to endure future droughts. "Why did you give them to me?" she inquired. "You could have taken them anywhere, sold them in any town. They're worth a considerable sum." Nkorin carried on with his carving, seemingly engrossed in the work. When he eventually spoke, his voice was softer than before. 3 days ago, I was on the brink of death. A cavalry soldier shot me, accusing me of stealing from the supply wagon." He glanced up at her. "I did not steal. I was hunting deer on our ancestral lands. The soldier didn't question me. He just fired." He set aside the carving, revealing a miniature horse taking shape. "I fled until my strength gave out. When I collapsed at your fence, I thought I would die there." His eyes met hers steadily. "Instead, you offered me refuge, tended to my wound. Then you gave me your only horse to ensure my survival. This debt must be repaid." The quiet dignity in his words left her with no further questions. Silvara served the simple stew in 2 bowls, and they dined in a comfortable silence as dusk enveloped the homestead. The mustangs settled down for the night, their occasional soft whinnies carried by the evening breeze. After the meal, Silvara recalled the leather pouch Nkorin had left on the railing. She retrieved it and untied the drawstring. Inside were several packets of dried herbs and a folded piece of paper with instructions written in a doctor's neat handwriting. Treatments for infection, fever, and wound care. "You saw a doctor in Copper Springs," she said, looking up from the herbs. Nkorin shook his head. "It's not safe for Apache and white settlements now. Too much anger since the last raids." He touched his bandaged side. "A medicine woman in my tribe. She's better than a white doctor for some wounds." Silvara carefully refolded the paper. "Did you tell her about me?" "I told her about a woman who values life over caution." His expression remained neutral, but his tone held a hint of approval. "She sent these for when you need healing." The conversation faded into silence again, but it was a different kind of silence than what Silvara had grown accustomed to in her solitude. This silence had depth, a sense of shared presence rather than emptiness. As night fell completely, practical considerations resurfaced. "You can sleep in the barn," she suggested, gesturing to the structure that had stood empty since the cattle were sold. "It's not much, but there's clean straw." Nkorin shook his head. "I will sleep with the horses tonight." He stood and gathered his few belongings. "At dawn, I will show you how to approach them. Each has a unique spirit." Silvara watched him walk toward the makeshift corral, where the mustangs greeted him with soft nickers of recognition. There was a natural confidence in how he moved among them, gently touching a nose here, a flank there, speaking in low tones in his native language. She should have been apprehensive. Everything she had learned about enduring in these lands cautioned against placing trust too readily, particularly in someone from a tribe known for raiding settlements. However, as she observed Nkorin arranging his blanket under the stars, amidst the mustangs, she sensed a fragile glimmer of hope, a feeling she hadn't known since Gareth's passing. Silvara stirred before the sun had risen, her thoughts remarkably lucid, despite the chaotic events of the day before. She hurriedly dressed and ventured outside to find Nkorin already stirring, seated on a smooth rock near the corral, his gaze fixed on the eastern sky, where the first traces of dawn began to paint the horizon. He didn't seem to notice her, and his stance, the stillness, the concentrated gaze, suggested this was a personal ritual. She occupied herself with morning tasks, igniting a fire in the stove and measuring out the valuable coffee beans for brewing. When she glanced up again, Nikorin had stood and was making his way toward the house, the initial sunbeams highlighting his features. "You're an early riser," he remarked. "Farming habit," she explained. "It's a hard routine to shake, even when there's no farm left to care for." His eyes scanned the barren orchard, the vacant garden bed, the fallow fields. "The land isn't lifeless, just patient," he said, gesturing toward the coffee pot. "That smells inviting." She poured 2 cups, astonished by how naturally they fell into this domestic rhythm, as if sharing morning coffee with an Apache warrior was an ordinary occurrence. They sipped in quiet companionship, watching the sun ascend, dispelling the remnants of the night. "I must soon rejoin my people," Nikorin said at last. "But first, the horses." The morning flew by in a whirl of activity. As Nikorin introduced Silvara to each Mustang in the herd, he demonstrated how to approach them gradually, confidently, with deference to their unique dispositions. Each horse bore a name in his tongue, which he translated for her. Starry Night for the ebony stallion, with white speckles like stars. Dawn Melody for the chestnut mare who whinnied at daybreak. Swift Stone for the swift gray yearling. This one, he said, leading forward the dun mare Silvara had ridden the previous day. She possesses a gentle spirit, ideal for daily riding, reliable. Silvara stroked the mare's neck, feeling the robust muscles beneath the sleek coat. "She's stunning." "She selected you," Nikorin stated plainly. "Yesterday, when we prepared to ride, she stepped forward for you." Silvara regarded him with doubt. "The horses choose their riders." A rare smile graced his face, softening his stern features. "Naturally? Did you suppose it was the other way around?" He proceeded through the herd, indicating the most suitable horses for various tasks, which could pull a plow, which could bear heavy burdens, which were swiftest for long journeys. He showed her methods for soothing skittish animals, for earning their trust, and for conveying intentions through body language instead of force. Silvara hung on his every word, asking questions and practicing the techniques he demonstrated. This knowledge differed greatly from what Gareth had taught her about handling tame farm horses. These wild Mustangs needed a different strategy, one of partnership rather than dominance. By noon, she had successfully interacted with half a dozen of the calmer horses, and had started to notice the unique personalities within the herd. The work was tiring but invigorating. For the first time in ages, she was creating something instead of just enduring. They took a break to enjoy a modest lunch of corn cakes and dried beef that Nikorin had packed. As they sat in the barn shadow, Silvara realized how much had shifted in just 2 days. The homestead no longer felt desolate. There was purpose again, activity, life. "You have a knack with them," Nikorin remarked, gesturing towards the horses. "You observe before you act." "My father raised horses in Pennsylvania," Silvara responded, "before the war took him. He always said horses can detect fear and impatience better than any other creature." Nikorin nodded thoughtfully. "A wise man," he said, studying her for a moment. "Like father, like daughter." This simple recognition of her skill and her connection to her father's heritage stirred something profound within Silvara. For months, she had only seen herself as a widow, a survivor, a woman battling against forces that seemed determined to overwhelm her. Nikorin saw something different. He saw ability, strength, continuity. "What are your plans for them?" he asked, motioning towards the Mustangs. Silvara pondered the question. "If I can, I'll establish a proper ranch," she said. "Breed them, sell some, keep the best. Maybe even get cattle again when the rains come back. She gazed at the clear sky, still stubbornly free of clouds. If the rains return, they will, Nkoran asserted. The elders say this drought is nearing its end. The signs are there for those who know how to read them. What signs? She asked. He pointed to a distant cluster of cottonwoods near the dried-up creek. The trees, he said. New growth at the tips of the branches. They sense water returning to the deep places. He then indicated a patch of wildflowers that had suddenly bloomed near the corral. These only flower before the rains come. Silvara had been so focused on survival that she had stopped noticing these subtle hints. How long? She asked. How long until the rains? Before the first snow, he replied, looking toward the mountains. Perhaps 6 weeks. Not long. 6 weeks. She could endure 6 weeks now with access to the hidden spring, with horses to trade if needed, and with a renewed sense of purpose. As the afternoon wore on, Nkoran taught her how to use a rope to guide the mustangs without breaking their spirit, how to recognize signs of health or distress, and how to become a part of the herd rather than just its owner. The teachings were hands-on, yet they embodied a philosophy that starkly contrasted with the frontier mindset of subduing and controlling. The Apache, he elaborated, as they rested after working with a lively young stallion, view horses as messengers from the spirit realm. They collaborate with us, not serve us. Once you grasp this, they willingly share their power. Silvara reflected on Gareth's method with horses, gentle yet assertive, always asserting his dominance. This approach was entirely different. It was a partnership built on mutual respect, not a rigid hierarchy. Your late husband, Nkoran remarked abruptly. The one in the photograph inside. He was a noble man. The sudden question took Silvara aback. Yes, she replied after a pause. He was diligent and just. He had aspirations for this place. Nkoran nodded. His spirit lingers here, in the fence posts, the orchard trees, and in your daily resilience. The straightforward remark threatened to shatter the composure Silvara had maintained since Gareth's passing. She averted her gaze, focusing on the distant mountains until she could speak steadily again. Tomorrow I must depart, Nkoran announced, seemingly oblivious to her emotional turmoil. My tribe will be worried. Silvara nodded, taken aback by the pang of disappointment his words stirred. Of course, you've already done more than enough, she gestured towards the mustangs. This is beyond what I could ever repay. There is no outstanding debt between us now, he asserted. But there is one more thing I must reveal to you before I leave. They returned to the concealed spring, this time with empty barrels to carry water back to the homestead. Silvara had grown more at ease on Gentle Spirit, the Dunnery responding to her slightest cue as if they had been companions for years, not mere hours. After filling the barrels, Nkoran guided her into the rock formation, following a narrow trail that wound upward through the stone. The ascent was challenging, necessitating that they dismount and carefully lead the horses over the rugged landscape. Just as Silvara was about to inquire about their destination, the path evened out and opened onto a plateau overlooking the entire valley. From this vantage point, she could see her homestead in the distance, the winding, dry creek bed, the vast stretch of parched grassland reaching the horizon, and most astonishingly, the faint green line where an underground water source must still be nourishing the deepest-rooted trees despite the drought. Observe, Nkoran said, gesturing westward. Your land, all of it. Silvara had never witnessed the valley from this angle before. Despite the drought's ravages, there was a raw beauty to it, the interplay of light and shadow across the terrain, the subtle shifts in color and texture, the potential for renewal when water returned. The Apache named this place the Mother's Hand, Nkoran said, tracing the valley's shape with his finger. 5 canyons, like fingers nourishing it. When the valley rains arrive, water rushes in from every direction, saturating the land. Even when the earth is parched, it retains that memory. Silvara examined the terrain more closely and understood what he was pointing out. She noticed 5 separate water channels that would direct rainwater into her valley when the storms eventually returned. The homestead was nestled in the heart of this natural formation. Gareth had chosen wisely, she murmured, even if he hadn't grasped the reason why. Nkoran gave a slight nod. Some individuals hear the land's voice without realizing they're listening, he explained, turning to face her. Hold on to this sight. When uncertainty strikes, when the labor seems insurmountable, recall what lies hidden beneath. They stood quietly as the sun started to set, casting the landscape in warm hues of amber and gold. In that instant, with the valley stretched out before her and the mustangs grazing calmly nearby, Silvara experienced the feeling she had believed was gone for good. She felt hope, not just for enduring, but for a future worth constructing. Nkoran left at daybreak 3 days later, not as soon as he had initially intended. The reason for the delay wasn't explicitly stated, but Silvara guessed it had something to do with the way he had examined the healing cut on her hand, a deep wound from fixing the corral, and had insisted on teaching her how to properly use the medicine woman's remedies. Or perhaps it was his resolve to make sure she could manage the Mustang stallion he called Thunder, the natural leader of the herd, whose cooperation would be crucial for handling the others. Regardless of his motives, those extra days proved to be incredibly beneficial. By the time he mounted his horse to leave, Silvara had gained more practical wisdom about surviving in this rugged territory than she had in 7 years of homesteading. Keep this in mind, Nkoran advised as he prepared to depart, adjusting the few supplies she had insisted he take. The horses comprehend more than you might think. Communicate with them respectfully, not just with orders. Silvara acknowledged him, standing in the yard that was now alive with equine activity. I will, she thought. Nkoran paused, then reached into his pouch and retrieved something wrapped in soft leather. He handed it to her without any formalities, simply saying, "For protection." Silvara unwrapped it to discover a knife unlike any she had ever seen. The blade had a slight curve. The handle was carved from antler and adorned with turquoise. It was clearly a cherished item, not something one would give to an acquaintance. I can't accept this, she started to say. You already have, he replied simply, then mounted his horse in a single, smooth motion. I will return before the winter moon to check on the herd. With that, he rode eastward, not glancing back, his upright figure gradually fading into the horizon until he vanished completely. Silvara remained standing, watching long after he had gone. The knife in her hand served as a tangible reminder that the remarkable events of the past days had not been a figment of her imagination, born out of desperation. The change began gradually, then gained speed like a boulder rolling down a hill. With control over the concealed spring and 30 mustangs serving as both labor and resources, Silvara's priorities shifted from basic survival to a more aspirational restoration. Her initial task was to secure the herd. The current corral could barely accommodate a quarter of the mustangs, so Silvara began expanding it. laboring from sunrise until her body ached for respite. She scavenged timber from deserted neighboring homesteads, hauling it back with Thunder Voice's assistance, who surprisingly became more compliant once she employed Nyra's communication techniques. The days settled into a new pattern. Mornings were dedicated to working with the horses, building trust, and understanding their unique personalities. Afternoons were spent on rebuilding and repairs, fixing the barn roof, constructing additional corrals, and clearing irrigation channels in preparation for the rains Nakoran had assured her would arrive. Evenings found her weary yet determined, documenting the day's achievements in a journal she had neglected for months. Her entries transitioned from brief notes on horse behavior to broader musings on her evolving situation. October the 12th, 1887. Gentle spirit now approaches when I whistle, even from the far side of the pasture. Thunder Voice still tests limits, but reacts to the hand signals Nyra taught me. Finished the North Corral extension today. Hands are blistered, but healing with the help of some herbal salve. The hidden spring continues to supply ample water, though transporting it remains time-consuming. October the 18th, 1887. Traded 2 of the younger colts to Caspian Wittenhall at the Copper Springs Mercantile. In exchange, I received 6 months' worth of supplies, seeds for spring planting, and a proper saddle for Gentle Spirit. Wittenhall inquired twice about the origin of the horses. I simply stated that they were payment for a debt, which wasn't entirely false. The practical advantages of the Mustangs became apparent more quickly than Silvara had expected. The territorial capital at Santa Fe boasted thriving horse markets, where even untamed Mustangs fetched decent prices, and the unique markings of Nakoran's herd garnered special attention. Silvara wasn't yet prepared to part with many, but strategic trades and sales provided necessities that would have been unimaginable just weeks prior. More unexpected were the intangible changes. Working with the horses required mindfulness, awareness of body language, and patience, qualities that drew Silvara out of the emotional numbness that had defined her grief. The Mustangs didn't dwell on her past losses. They responded to her present self, insisting on genuine interaction rather than empty routine. "Easy now," Silvara whispered, maintaining a calm voice despite the sweat dripping down her back. The chestnut mare, whom Nakoran had named Storm Dancer, snorted and pawed at the ground, eyes rolling to reveal the whites. Unlike most of the herd, this one had evaded all attempts at handling, flinching from human contact as if it scalded. Silvara had spent over an hour attempting to approach the mare, entering the corral and then backing away when the horse showed signs of distress, slowly closing the gap with each try. Her arms ached from keeping them extended, palms up in the calming gesture Nakoran had shown her. "I won't give up on you," she murmured, taking a small step forward. "You have too much spirit to let fear control you." The mare shook her head, her mane glinting like copper wire in the afternoon sun. For an instant, Silvara saw her own reflection in those tired eyes. The same guarded resistance, the same resolve to keep the world at a distance. How many people had tried to reach out to her after Gareth's passing, offering help that she had refused out of pride, grief, or a volatile mix of both? Silvara paused, a sudden understanding washing over her. She had been following Nakoran's instructions mechanically, going through the motions without grasping the core principle. The Apache had not merely taught her horse training methods. He had shown her how to be present, respectful, patient, yet persistent. She exhaled slowly, letting her shoulders relax and consciously releasing the tension she had been holding. "I see you," she said to the mayor, meaning it more deeply than ever. "I see your fear, and I'm still here." Something in the air between them changed. Storm Dancer's ears, which had been flattened back in defense, flicked forward. The mayor lowered her head slightly, nostrils flaring as she took in Silvara's scent. Then, so gradually that it seemed to happen in slow motion, she took one step forward. Silvara stayed completely still, her hand extended, breathing steadily. Another step and another, until finally the mayor's soft nose brushed against her palm, warm breath tickling her skin. "There you are," Silvara whispered, tears unexpectedly welling up in her eyes. "There you are." Copper Springs had flourished since Silvara's last visit a month ago. New buildings lined the main street, evidence of the silver discovery in the nearby hills that had breathed new life into the settlement, despite the persistent drought. Silvara rode, gentle spirit, confidently through town, leading 2 mustangs on long reins behind her. The response was swift and satisfying. Men paused their work to admire the horses. Women stopped in doorways. Children eagerly pointed them out. These were not the usual rugged frontier horses, but magnificent creatures with unique markings and proud stances. "Mrs. Riversgate," Ironwright Garnetwell called out, stepping from the sheriff's office. "I didn't expect to see you in town. I heard you were holed up in that valley all by yourself." Silvara reined Gentle Spirit to a halt. "News spreads quickly, Ironwright, especially when Caspian Wittenhall is the messenger. He hasn't stopped talking about those horses you traded him." Garnetwell circled the mustangs appreciatively. He said they were the finest stock he'd seen in years. He wouldn't reveal where you acquired them, though. Silvara maintained a composed demeanor. "Just a stroke of luck, Ironwright. The kind that finds you when you're not even looking for it." Garnetwell nodded in agreement, stroking the mane of one of the mustangs. The black gelding allowed the contact, but kept a wary eye on the man. "Interested in selling these 2? He asked. "It depends on what you're offering," Silvara responded. "I'm here to see the bank manager first, and then I might stop by the land office." Garnetwell's eyebrows shot up. "The land office? Thinking of selling out?" he inquired. "Not at all," Silvara clarified. "I'm actually looking to grow." The Ironwright's surprise was palpable. "Expand into what? That whole area has been deserted." "Precisely," Silvara replied, her voice filled with a confidence that was new to her. "That means the price should be quite affordable." She left Garnetwell standing there, watching her as she made her way down the main street towards the Territorial Bank. Inside, the same clerk who had rejected her loan application after Gareth's passing now stood up straighter and offered her a cup of coffee. "Mrs. Riversgate, what a delightful surprise. We don't often see folks from the outlying homesteads these days." "I can imagine," Silvara replied, her tone cool. "I'd like to discuss opening a proper account with Mr. Harrivan and explore some potential business ventures." The subsequent meeting proved to be another pivotal moment. Harrivan, the bank manager who had once viewed Silvara as a desperate widow clinging to worthless land, now leaned in with genuine interest as she detailed her plans for a horse-breeding operation. The 2 mustangs she had brought along, clearly visible through the bank's front window, served as concrete proof of her intentions. When Silvara left the bank 2 hours later, she had not only opened an account with the earnings from her previous horse deals, but had also secured a preliminary agreement for a small loan to buy neighboring properties. The terms weren't overly favorable, but they were reasonable, reflecting her shift from a figure of pity to a promising businesswoman. That evening, seated on her porch with a cup of real coffee, unlike the Corey substitute she had resorted to months earlier, Silvara unfolded Gareth's old map of the valley. With a pencil, she marked the properties she aimed to acquire. The Anderson place to the west, with its deeper well, and the Grindstone homestead to the north, featuring a sturdy barn and bunkhouse that could eventually accommodate ranch hands. The scale of her aspirations should have been daunting. Just 6 weeks prior, she had been considering giving up everything. Now she was planning an endeavor that would demand years of labor and capital she didn't yet have. Yet, fear was absent, replaced by a steadfast resolve she recognized from her younger self, the woman who had chosen to leave Philadelphia society for an uncertain future on the frontier. A gentle whinny from the corral caught her attention. Storm Dancer stood by the fence, gazing at me with those perceptive eyes that seemed to challenge me to embrace my better self. The mare had achieved significant progress, now permitting herself to be guided with a rope halter, though riding was still a work in progress. "We're both evolving, aren't we?" I murmured to the horse, releasing old anxieties. Storm Dancer nodded as if in accord, then turned to rejoin the herd. I awoke to an unusual sound, a persistent, rhythmic pounding on the cabin roof. For a moment, groggy from sleep, I imagined the mustangs had somehow escaped and were galloping across the yard. Then a different realization sent me rushing from bed to the window. Rain. Genuine rain. Not the tantalizing drizzles that had occasionally teased the valley, but heavy drops falling in sheets from a sky thick with clouds. I flung open the door and stepped onto the porch, extending my hand to feel the cool dampness against my skin, watching as the parched ground darkened, greedily soaking up the precious water. The mustangs were in a frenzy, circling the corral, heads held high, tails streaming. Storm Warden Whisperwind led the jubilation, rearing and trumpeting as if personally responsible for summoning the deluge. I laughed out loud, a sound so unfamiliar to my own ears that it startled me. How long had it been since I'd laughed? Since before Gareth's illness. Certainly, months of hardship and sorrow had stolen that simple pleasure from me. Yet here it was, bubbling up unexpectedly like water from a hidden spring. I stood in the rain until my nightgown was drenched, face tilted upward, allowing the water to wash away grime and exhaustion. Nakoran had been correct. The rains had arrived before the first snow, just as he'd foretold. When I finally went inside to change into dry clothes, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin, and paused, momentarily taken aback. The woman staring back at me was both familiar and strange. The same features I'd known all my life, but infused with a vitality I hadn't seen since my youth. The gaunt specter of recent months had been replaced by someone alive and present. The rain persisted throughout the day, steady and life-giving. I worked through it, making necessary adjustments to ensure the water was directed properly, grateful that I'd had the foresight to clear the irrigation ditches in anticipation of this day. By noon, the dry creek bed had become a modest stream, water flowing where there had been only dust for seasons. The path to the hidden spring was treacherous with rain, slick stones demanding careful footing. I made my way cautiously, drawn by a need to see how the rainfall had affected this place that had sustained me through the worst of the drought. The grotto had transformed. A once quiet pool, nourished by a gentle waterfall, had transformed into a lively basin, with water pouring down the rocky face in several streams. The plants that had previously lined the edges now stood tall and vividly green against the red stone. Silvara perched on a rock by the water's edge, captivated by the way raindrops rippled the surface. This secluded retreat had taught her that life could thrive even when hidden from plain sight. Nakorin had always known this truth intuitively. Silvara, however, had only come to understand it through hardship. "Thank you," she murmured, speaking to the spring, the rain, the very earth, and perhaps to the Apache who had shared these insights with her. Her words seemed inadequate for the depth of her gratitude, but they were all she could express. As the sun began to set, the rain eased, and the clouds parted, allowing golden light to bathe the glistening landscape. Silvara finished her evening tasks, ensuring the mustangs were safe and securing the homestead for the night. The air held a new scent, fresh and full of promise, carrying the aroma of wet soil and reviving plants. She stopped by the fence post where Nakorin had left his final mark before leaving, a small carved symbol she now knew signified water and renewal. Her fingers followed the carvings, wondering when he would come back as he had promised, what he would make of the changes she had made, and if he would support her growing aspirations. The mustangs had settled down for the night, grouping together in their usual social order. Thunder Voice stood slightly apart, always watchful. Storm Dancer had found her place among the other mares, no longer set apart by her fear. The herd had adjusted to their new situation without losing their inherent nature. A balance Silvara was learning to achieve within herself. By lamplight, Silvara made her final journal entries, recording the rainfall measurements, the creek's revival, and plans for the next day's work. The pages were filling up quickly, ink filling the spaces just as purpose had filled the void left by her loss. November 9th, 1887. The first substantial rainfall. The creek flows once more. The soil is already showing signs of recovery, nearly 2 inches in the rain barrel. The mustangs sensed it coming yesterday. Restless, alert. I should have noticed the signs. Tomorrow, I'll ride to the Anderson property to evaluate its condition, now that the rain has shown which buildings have endured the drought. The bank approved the purchase at yesterday's meeting, though Harrove still thinks I am taking an unnecessary risk. Maybe I am, but I've learned something about risk and security. The drought showed me that what seems most secure can disappear in an instant. The mustangs have taught me that genuine security doesn't come from holding on to the known, but from embracing change, forging new bonds, and trusting my instincts in uncharted lands. Gareth would have grasped this concept. He might have always known it. She shut the journal and blew out the lamp, but didn't head to bed right away. Instead, she ventured outside again, lured by the crispness of the sky after the rain. Stars shone with astonishing brightness, mirrored in the puddles that speckled the yard like scattered looking-glasses. The world had been renewed by the water, much like how Silvara had been reshaped by events she never would have selected, but now wouldn't exchange for anything. The drought had reduced her to the basics. What regrew was demonstrating to be tougher, more adaptable, and more genuine than what had been forfeited. Far off, a coyote howled, an eerie sound that once would have emphasized her solitude. Tonight it felt more like a neighbor's welcome, recognizing her role in this rugged yet breathtaking terrain. Silvara listened until the echoes dissipated, then faced the cabin, ready for sleep, ready for whatever the next day might bring to this land of untamed compassion. But first she intentionally approached the old juniper tree near the house, the sole living thing that had endured the driest part of the drought without human aid. From her pocket she took out the knife Narcath had presented her, and meticulously etched a small mark into the aged bark, the Apache sign for thankfulness, a note for when he came back, evidence of the change that had happened during his leave. A change not merely of situation, but of spirit. The rains that ended the drought in early November revived Salvation Valley, but they also brought unforeseen outcomes. 3 weeks after the initial downpour, Silvara rode Gentle Spirit along the northern edge of what was now her enlarged property. The Anderson and Grindstone homesteads had been acquired, their deserted buildings slowly repurposed for her expanding enterprise. The creek that had been a dry gash was now a lively watercourse, banks flourishing with fresh growth. Where parched soil had fissured, delicate sprouts emerged, infusing the landscape with cautious hues. The change was almost miraculous. But Silvara was discovering that miracles frequently drew unwelcome notice. She reined in Gentle Spirit at the crest of a gentle slope, looking toward the eastern horizon, where the territorial road snaked toward Copper Springs. A dust cloud indicated approaching riders, the third group that week. Since news of the Mustang herd and Silvara's remarkable triumph had spread, amidst regional struggle, visitors had grown more frequent. Some were innocuous, inquisitive neighbors revisiting homesteads they deserted, traders aiming to establish business ties. A reporter from Santa Fe was eager to chronicle the tale of the widow who dared to challenge the drought. However, other visitors were far more unsettling. Silvara drew the Apache knife from its sheath, now a constant companion at her side, and used it to sever a stalk of prairie grass, inspecting the seed head with a thoughtful gaze. The knife had evolved into an indispensable tool and a symbol, a testament to Nyra's wisdom and her own burgeoning resilience. She would need both in the trials that lay ahead, she feared. As the approaching riders came into clearer view, she could make out 4 distinct figures. 3 men and a woman, their strides purposeful rather than the leisurely pace of tourists. Silvara's eyes narrowed as she recognized 2 of them. Lieutenant Ironmere from the nearby cavalry outpost at Copper Springs, and Caspian Wittenhall from the Mercantile. The others were unfamiliar to her. She sheathed the knife and urged Gentle Spirit forward to intercept them, preferring to engage them on open ground rather than be cornered at her homestead. Mrs. Rivers' Gate, Wittenhall greeted as they drew near, tipping his hat. A splendid day for a ride. Silvara acknowledged with a nod, maintaining a composed expression, despite her quickening heartbeat. Mr. Wittenhall, Lieutenant, what brings the cavalry to Salvation Valley? Lieutenant Ironmere, a stern man with a meticulously waxed mustache and rigid bearing, cleared his throat with an air of importance. Official matters, ma'am. Allow me to introduce Indian Agent Garrison from the reservation to the north and Dr. Aurelia Grayvale from the Department of the Interior in Washington. The woman, appearing to be in her 40s, dressed practically yet with an evident Eastern elegance in her tailored riding habit, extended a gloved hand. Mrs. Riversgate, I've heard extraordinary accounts of your endeavors here, particularly your horses. Silvara briefly shook the offered hand, assessing the situation. News travels swiftly these days. Indeed it does, Agent Garrison interjected. He was a gaunt, pallid man, his expression perpetually pinched, especially when discussing the 30 purebred Apache Mustangs that had vanished from the reservation 3 months prior. The implication hung heavy in the air. Silvara's expression remained unreadable, though her mind raced. Nyra had never mentioned any connection to a reservation regarding the horses. Had he deliberately misled her, or merely omitted pertinent details. "My horses were a gift," she replied cautiously. "Just compensation for aid provided." "Aid to whom, exactly?" Lieutenant Ironmere inquired, his tone sharpening. Silvara held his gaze steadfastly. "To a man in need. I didn't inquire about his affairs or origins." "Convenient," Garrison muttered. "And this man, did he happen to be Apache? Perhaps known as Nakoran or Stalking Wolf?" The realization that they knew Nakoran by name sent a shiver down Silvara's spine. This was no casual inquiry, but a deliberate investigation. "I didn't catch his name," she lied, grateful for the years of poker games with Gareth that had taught her to mask her expressions. "He was injured. I offered him help. He left the horses in return. Plain and simple." Dr. Greyvale scrutinized Silvara with a keen gaze that left nothing unnoticed. "Mrs. Riversgate, I assure you, no one is suggesting any misconduct on your part. We are simply attempting to gather the facts. These horses are a vital tribal resource, safeguarded by federal regulations. Their unauthorized removal from reservation land is considered theft. As I understand it," Silvara remarked, "the Apache people enjoyed freedom long before any artificial borders were imposed on their ancestral lands. It's possible these horses originally belonged to them." Garrison's expression grew stern. "Such reasoning can lead to complications," he warned. "Mrs. Riversgate, the reservation system serves a purpose. It brings order, control, and civilization. Yet," Silvara interjected calmly, "it seems to have failed miserably in preventing a starving Apache from being shot by a soldier and left to perish on my land. Quite the civilization indeed." Lieutenant Ironmere's hand instinctively moved to his weapon, though he refrained from drawing it. "So you're acknowledging that you sheltered Nakoran. He is sought for questioning regarding several incidents, including the disappearance of these horses and an assault on a supply wagon." "I aided an injured individual," Silvara replied, her voice steady, "as any decent person would. As for these supposed incidents, I am unaware of any involvement." Dr. Greyvale raised a hand, interrupting what was clearly becoming a heated exchange. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation at your residence, Mrs. Riversgate." "I am eager to examine these horses personally. My agency has a keen interest in indigenous breeding methods." The invitation was courteous, but it carried an undeniable air of official authority. Silvara had no choice but to comply. "Very well," she agreed, guiding her gentle spirit toward home. "Though I must caution you, the horses decide who they permit near them. They are remarkably perceptive." Thundervoice picked up on the tension right away. The noble stallion placed himself between the visitors and the rest of the herd, ears alert, nostrils flaring as he evaluated these newcomers. Behind him, the mustangs had assembled in a defensive arrangement Silvara recognized from Nakoran's lessons. The mares and foals were at the center, with the stronger horses forming a protective perimeter. "Remarkable," Dr. Greyvale murmured, observing from a respectful distance. "Observe that conformation, the muscle definition. These are no ordinary mustangs." "Indeed they are not," Agent Garrison remarked sharply. "They are the product of generations of selective breeding by the Apache. The tribe regards them as sacred creatures, though that's merely superstition, of course." Silvara held back a sharp response. Instead, she let out a soft whistle, the signal she used to call her gentle spirit. The dun mare promptly broke away from the herd and trotted to her side, showcasing the bond they had formed. "Sacred or not," Silvara said, stroking the mare's neck. They possess an intelligence that surpasses any domestic breed I have ever come across. They hold a grudge against cruelty and remember acts of kindness with equal clarity. Dr. Greyvale moved forward carefully, her hand outstretched with the palm facing up, mimicking the gestures Silvara had learned from Nakorn. To Silvara's astonishment, the gentle spirit allowed the woman to make contact, though she remained wary of the men. "You've clearly formed a strong bond with them," Dr. Greyvale remarked. "It's remarkable, considering these horses were supposedly stolen just a few months ago." Silvara picked up on the subtle backing in the comment. Despite being a government official, Dr. Greyvale appeared to be drawing her own conclusions. Lieutenant Ironmere was not as convinced. "Regardless of your bond, Mrs. Riversgate, the fact is these horses are federal property by virtue of their tribal ownership. Agent Garrison has the authority to seize them." "On what basis?" Silvara challenged. "I acquired them as legitimate payment. There are witnesses in town who can confirm that I've been trading and breeding them openly, not concealing them as if they were stolen." "The basis, Mrs. Riversgate," Garrison replied with feigned patience, "is that Nakorn lacked the authority to take them from the tribal lands. He's neither a chief nor a council elder, just a troublemaker with romantic notions of the old ways." Silvara's anger surged. "Those old ways sustained his people for centuries, before your reservation system starved them into compliance." "Tread carefully, ma'am," Lieutenant Ironmere cautioned. "Such talk borders on Indian sympathizing, which is not a safe stance in these territories." The veiled threat lingered in the air. Silvara was keenly aware of her precarious situation, a lone woman standing against government representatives. She might have local backing from those who had gained from her horse trading, but that support would vanish swiftly if she were labeled an Indian sympathizer, or worse, an accomplice to theft. Inside the cabin, gathered around the table that Gareth had crafted from cottonwood, the discussion persisted with a deceptive politeness. Wittenhall had stayed mostly quiet, his unease apparent in his restless movements and averted gaze. As a local merchant who had benefited from deals with Silvara, he was torn between his community loyalties and his deference to authority. "Allow me to be frank," Dr. Greyvale said, placing down the coffee cup Silvara had offered. "The Department of the Interior is conducting an extensive study of indigenous resource management, including horse breeding methods. These Mustangs present a unique chance for documentation before they are confiscated." "You mean?" Silvara stated bluntly. Dr. Greyvale's face betrayed no emotion. "I'm not here to enforce regulations, Mrs. Riversgate. My interest is academic, and yours is practical," Garrison interjected. "These horses need to be returned to the reservation, where they can benefit the entire tribe, not just a rebel like Nakorn." Silvara assessed the agent, noticing the inconsistencies in his self-righteous concern. "It's surprising that you're so enthusiastic about tribal privileges, Mr. Garrison. I've been informed that life on the reservation is miserable. Food supplies are scarce, the water is unsafe, and disease is widespread." Garrison brushed these issues aside, labeling them as mere temporary setbacks. "The key point," he emphasized, "is that these horses need to be under appropriate management." "Under your management," Silvara specified. "Under federal management," Lieutenant Ironmere rectified. "And indeed, Mrs. Riversgate, we possess the power to confiscate them." Nevertheless, he glanced towards Dr. Greyvale. "Considering the extraordinary situation and the department's involvement, we are willing to propose an alternative solution." Silvara paused, growing increasingly wary. You may keep half of the herd, Ironmere elaborated, provided you fully collaborate with Dr. Greyvale's investigations, and most crucially, share any intelligence you have about Nakohi's movements and activities. And there it lay, the true motive behind their visit. The horses were being used as bargaining chips. Nakoran was the actual objective. I've already told you I have no idea where he went, Silvara asserted, the deception now rolling off her tongue more smoothly. He abandoned the horses and headed east. That's all I know. No. Dr. Greyvale leaned in, her scientific composure faltering, revealing a spark of genuine intrigue. Mrs. Riversgate, could you elaborate on what Nakoran shared with you about these horses? Their lineage, their importance to his tribe? Silvara faltered, unsure of how much to disclose. What had been intimate conversations with Nakoran could transform into perilous knowledge in the wrong ears. Yet Dr. Greyvale appeared sincerely eager to comprehend rather than exploit. He explained that they weren't captured, but Silvara eventually responded. They willingly joined him. That horses convey messages from the spirit realm. Garrison scoffed dismissively. Typical, superstitious rubbish, is it? Dr. Greyvale countered, catching everyone off guard. Indigenous ecological wisdom frequently encapsulates advanced insights into animal behavior, veiled in spiritual terminology. Mrs. Riversgate, did Nakoran exhibit particular methods for interacting with these horses? Before Silvara could respond, the sound of approaching riders disrupted their discussion. Through the window, she spotted 3 riders approaching from the direction of Copper Springs, Ironwright Garnetwell, and 2 deputies. Back up? She inquired of Ironmere, her voice icy. The lieutenant appeared genuinely taken aback. I did not summon them. The scenario was unraveling swiftly. Silvara stood, her mind racing through potential courses of action. She couldn't confront the combined might of the Indian Agency, the cavalry, and the local constabulary. However, relinquishing the Mustangs, Nakoran Kohi's gift, her means of livelihood, and now her duty, was inconceivable. As Ironwright Garnetwell dismounted in the yard, Silvara made a hasty decision. She discreetly withdrew Nico's knife from its scabbard and placed it in Dr. Greyvale's hand under the table, concealed from the men's view. The Apache named this place the Mother's Hand, she murmured urgently. 5 canyons nourishing 1 valley. The concealed spring lies within the Northwest Canyon, tucked behind the towering red rock formation. If genuine understanding is what you seek, rather than mere dominance, venture there. Witness what I have witnessed. Dr. Greyvale's eyes flickered with surprise, but she swiftly concealed the knife up her sleeve with practiced stealth as Garnetwell entered without an announcement. Mrs. Riversgate, the marshal, gave a stern nod. Gentlemen, ma'am, I regret to inform you that a troubling matter is unfolding. Ironmere rose from his seat. What manner of trouble, Garnetwell? He inquired. Reports have come in of Apache warriors spotted less than 10 miles north of here, Garnetwell responded. A hunting party from the reservation, it seems, but they are armed. I thought you should be aware, Lieutenant, considering your ongoing investigation. The mood in the cabin altered abruptly. Garrison's face paled, while Ironmere's hand instinctively moved to his sidearm. How many? The lieutenant asked sharply. 6, according to my deputy who encountered them, Garnetwell replied. They are led by a warrior known as Stalking Wolf Narohe. Silvara maintained a composed expression with great effort, though her heart pounded. He had returned as he had vowed, but into a perilous situation neither of them had foreseen. "We must return to town at once," Garrison urged, already reaching for his hat. "If those warriors are on the prowl." "They are hunting, not raiding," Silvara interjected, as your deputy confirmed. "They are on ancestral lands they have used for generations. Lands that are now under territorial control," Ironmere argued, "and conveniently near these disputed horses." The implication hung heavy in the air. They suspected a coordinated attempt to reclaim the Mustangs. Silvara needed to ease the tension before it erupted into violence. "Ironright," she said, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. "I have had peaceful interactions with the Apache in the past. Perhaps I could speak with them, explain the circumstances, and avert any unnecessary conflict." Garnetwell raised an eyebrow. "You propose we allow you to ride out to meet an armed Apache hunting party alone?" "Not alone," Dr. Grayvale interjected unexpectedly. "I will accompany Mrs. Riversgate. As a federal representative, my presence would ensure proper procedures are followed, and honestly, gentlemen, a peaceful resolution would be more favorable in my report to Washington than an avoidable confrontation." Her unexpected support caught everyone off guard, especially Ironmere and Garrison. The lieutenant voiced objections about the dangers and protocols, but Dr. Grayvale reminded him of her departmental authority. "The Interior Department outranks a frontier cavalry outpost, Lieutenant," she stated calmly, "and diplomatic solutions are always preferable to military ones, are they not?" They journeyed in silence for the first mile, Silvara atop Gentle Spirit, Dr. Grayvale on her reliable gelding. Behind them the men remained at the homestead, Ironmere insisting on a more thorough examination of the Mustang herd while awaiting their return. "They will follow us soon enough," Dr. Grayvale remarked after some time. "Ironmere is not the type to let women handle negotiations, regardless of my position," Silvara agreed with a nod. "We should capitalize on our advantage while we have it." Silvara directed Gentle Spirit away from the main path, heading towards a rugged outcrop. "Is this the quickest route to the Apache camp, or are we heading elsewhere?" Dr. Grayvale inquired astutely. Silvara took a moment to reevaluate the older woman. "You're more than you seem, Dr. Grayvale." A faint smile crossed Dr. Grayvale's face. "In this world, few women have the privilege of being precisely who they seem, Mrs. Riversgate. I believe you grasp that more than anyone." They reached a high point that offered a view back towards the homestead. The men were visible in the distance, with Ironmere making vigorous gestures as Garnetwell moved towards his horse. They had roughly 15 minutes before the pursuit began. Silvara made a swift decision. "There is no Apache hunting party. Dr." Grayvale's eyebrow lifted in surprise. "No?" she asked. Then Ironright Garnetwell's deputy saw precisely what Nakoran intended for him to see, Silvara explained. "Enough to warrant a report, but not enough to provoke action. It was a ruse." Comprehension flickered in Dr. Grayvale's eyes. "Ingenious. But to what end?" "Because Nakoran sensed something amiss," Silvara replied, the pieces falling into place as she spoke. "He's been observing. He noticed the government official's arrival. He created a distraction to shift attention away from—" Silvara paused, the realization striking her. "Away from the true target," she finished, turning Gentle Spirit around. "We must return to the homestead immediately." Upon their arrival, they found the yard in disarray. The Mustang herd had somehow broken free from their enclosure and was circling the buildings in organized patterns, effectively hindering Ironmere and his companions from mounting their horses. Storm Warden Whisperwind led the maneuver, guiding the flow with powerful bursts of speed and strategic placements. Standing calmly on the porch, as if he had never left, was Nyra. He was dressed in traditional Apache attire, including a prominent medicine pouch. His stance exuded an authority that had not been apparent during his recovery at the homestead. Ironmere had drawn his pistol, but seemed unsure whether to use it against the circling horses. Garrison huddled near the water trough, while Wittenhall and Garnetwell merely observed the scene with a mix of wonder and unease. "Hold your fire, Lieutenant," Silvara called out as she dismounted. "They won't harm you unless you provoke them." Ironmere's face was flushed with anger. "Control your horses, Mrs. Riversgate," he demanded. "They're not just her horses," Nyra interjected, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "They belong to themselves first, to the earth and sky second, to the Apache people third." His gaze shifted to Garrison. "Not to corrupt agents who sell their rations and blame shortages on delivery issues." The accusation struck like a physical blow. Garrison stammered denials, but his face had paled. "What is he talking about?" Dr. Greyvale dismounted with a swiftness that belied her status, her voice commanding. Nyra delved into his vest and produced a folded paper. It contained proof, supply records, merchant receipts from 4 regions, and the names of military officers who had enriched themselves while my people went hungry. The weight of the disclosure lingered in the air like an impending storm. Ironmere's grip on his pistol tightened, but doubt had eclipsed his previous assurance. "Lies," Pearson murmured weakly. "Indian fabrications," Narcath corrected. "Government documents, seized from government offices by those with the means and the moral fortitude." He fixed his gaze on Dr. Greyvale. "There are still those in your Washington who uphold justice, Doctor." The ramifications were immense. It wasn't merely Garrison's deceit, but a web of officials benefiting from the reservation's plight, and insiders working to unveil them. Silvara suddenly grasped the truth. The Mustangs had never been the core issue. They had served as a convenient excuse to scrutinize Nyra, who held evidence that could topple influential figures. The horses weren't stolen, Silvara realized, the pieces clicking into place. They were compensation from someone within the government who aided you in securing those documents. Nyra gave a single nod, confirming her deduction. The horses had chosen to accompany me, to help convey the truth that might save my people. He held Silvara's gaze, much like you chose to assist a stranger, unaware it would save you. The impasse might have persisted indefinitely if Dr. Greyvale hadn't intervened. She exuded authority, her stance commanding despite her stature and gender. "Agent Garrison," she declared, "you are suspended from duty pending an investigation. Lieutenant Ironmere, escort him to the territorial capital at once. These documents," she accepted the papers from Narcath with a nod, "will be sent directly to the Secretary of the Interior under my personal seal." "You can't seriously believe," Ironmere started. "I believe in evidence, Lieutenant," Dr. Greyvale interrupted. "And I've witnessed enough corruption in Indian affairs to find these accusations entirely plausible. Ironright Garnetwell," she continued. "I trust you'll ensure everyone leaves peacefully." Garnetwell, ever the pragmatist, sensed the shifting power dynamics. "Yes, ma'am," he agreed. "Lieutenant, I advise you to comply." "This is far beyond our jurisdiction now." As the men reluctantly prepared to leave, Thunder's voice signaled to the herd, which moved aside to grant them access to their horses. The synchronized precision of the movement underscored what Silvara had come to understand. These were no ordinary creatures, but allies in a mission whose true scale was only now becoming apparent. Standing beside Nicorn on the porch as the government officials departed, Silvara sensed that she was finally seeing him clearly, not as the injured stranger she had rescued, but as a man driven by a clear mission and foresight, battling for his people's endurance with wisdom and calculated patience. "You were certain," she murmured. "You were certain they would eventually search for the horses, that the search would lead them to you." "I had hoped," he replied, "that by that time the truth would be prepared to surface." He gazed out at the mustangs, now peacefully grazing as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. "I had hoped that you would be prepared as well." "Prepared? For what?" Nicorin turned to face her directly, "To choose where you will stand in the conflict between truth and authority, between those who would seize and those who would distribute." He motioned towards the expanded homestead, the thriving land. "You have created something significant here. Now you must decide what it will signify to others." As the weight of his words settled in, Silvara understood this was the genuine revelation, not merely the unveiling of deceit or the enigma of the Mustang's lineage, but the acknowledgement that her personal evolution carried a duty greater than herself, the choice of what kind of world she would contribute to with the new opportunity she had been granted. Dr. Greyvale stayed behind after the others left, her professional composure easing once they were alone. "Mrs. River's Gate," she said, returning Nicorin's knife with a knowing glance. "I think we have much to talk about regarding the future of this extraordinary place, and these extraordinary horses." The sun dipped below the horizon over Salvation Valley, casting the land in shades of amber and gold, reminiscent of that first night when a wounded stranger had fallen at Silvara's gate. Everything had shifted since then, especially Silvara herself, and as darkness fell, 3 figures gathered around her table. The widow who had discovered her inner strength, the warrior who had brought both truth and horses, and the scientist who recognized the worth in ancient wisdom. Together they began to chart a new course ahead, one that might uphold both fairness and compassion in this rugged yet breathtaking region. Spring arrived early in Salvation Valley in 1888, as if nature was eager to make up for the previous year's dry spell. The stream flowed swiftly and full with meltwater from the distant peaks. Fields once parched and desolate now teemed with new life. Blossoms and wildflowers blanketed the hillsides in a vibrant display. But the most striking change had taken place at the former River's Gate homestead, now recognized across the territory as Covenant Ranch. On a clear April morning, Silvara stood on the ridge overlooking her expanded estate, barely recognizing it as the desperate failing place she had nearly forsaken 8 months prior. The original cabin stood preserved as a reminder of tougher times, but it was now accompanied by new buildings, a grand main house built from local stone, and large stables and a corral, and notably, a circular structure designed in the traditional Apache style near the creek. The Mustang herd had increased to nearly 50 animals with the arrival of spring foals, their presence infusing life and purpose into land that had once felt blighted. However, it wasn't just horses that now inhabited the ranch. A dozen Apache families had set up seasonal camps in the northern area, and emissaries from 3 other tribes had visited recently, attracted by whispers of the transformations occurring in this once overlooked valley. Silvara felt the pocket watch, a recent treat bought with earnings from the ranch's first official horse auction. The territorial governor would arrive shortly for the ceremony, accompanied by representatives from Washington after 4 months of meticulous planning and discussions. This day would commemorate the grand opening of the Western Indigenous Horse Breeding and Agricultural Conservation Center, the first establishment of its kind in the nation. Silvara still had fleeting thoughts of escape, but Nakoran's voice interrupted from behind her, carrying the familiar humor she had come to appreciate during their months of collaboration. She turned with a smile. For at least 10 seconds every morning I consider fleeing, but then I remember there's nowhere else I'd rather be, she admitted. He stood beside her at the ridge. His appearance had changed significantly since their first meeting, though he still moved with the fluid grace of a hunter. He now wore a practical mix of Apache and Western attire, reflecting his role as a bridge between two cultures. The government documents in his saddlebag, granting him official recognition as both a tribal representative and a federally appointed consultant, would have seemed impossible a year ago. The governor has brought journalists, Nakoran noted, gazing toward the eastern road. After today, your face will be recognized far beyond this territory. Yours, too, Silvara reminded him. Dr. Greyvale ensured your name appears first on all the official papers. The corner of his mouth twitched slightly. Aurelia is adept at fighting old systems with their own tactics. He used the doctor's first name with the familiarity of deep respect, a testament to how their unlikely partnership had strengthened over months of strategic planning. Following the altercation at the homestead last fall, Dr. Aurelia Greyvale had shown herself to be an unexpected yet powerful ally. The evidence Nyra had compiled against Agent Garrison had indeed reached the Secretary of the Interior, sparking investigations that uncovered corruption throughout the reservation system. But Dr. Greyvale had gone further, using the scandal to propose a groundbreaking alternative, a demonstration project where indigenous wisdom could be preserved and recorded while fostering sustainable livelihoods. Silvara's ranch, with its remarkable revival and unique Mustang herd, became the ideal setting. The legal framework took many months to set up, involving congressional acts, territorial exemptions, and innovative interpretations of existing Indian affairs policies. The outcome was unparalleled. A privately owned ranch was converted into a quasi-governmental entity with tribal co-management, where indigenous horse breeding methods would be officially recorded, taught, and preserved. Silvara observed, noticing Nakoran's thoughtful gaze as he looked out over the valley. Not second thoughts, she realized, but memories. He gestured towards the far-off foothills. My grandfather took me hunting there as a child, before maps were drawn, before permits were needed to walk our ancestral lands. His face was calm, but Silvara had learned to interpret the slight changes in his eyes. He would struggle with this agreement, collaborating with the same government that had restricted our people. Is that how you view it? As a compromise? Silvara asked Narkath. He pondered the question with his usual meticulousness. I see it as adaptation. The old ways maintained through new methods. He turned to face her. The Mustangs adapted when drought struck. They didn't cling to old territories and perish from thirst. They found new water, new ways to survive. The analogy was fitting. Throughout the winter, as news of the project spread, Silvara had watched Nakoran skillfully navigate between worlds, using Washington's newfound remorse over reservation mistreatment to gain unheard-of concessions, all while keeping the respect of tribal elders, who were wary of any dealings with the government. It was a delicate balance, full of potential for miscommunication on both sides. Yet he managed it with the same quiet assurance he displayed when working with the Mustangs. "They're arriving," Silvara remarked, seeing dust on the eastern horizon, indicating approaching carriages. "Prepared to shape history?" Nakoran's expression stayed solemn. "History was not gentle to my people the first time. We'll see if second chances reach beyond this valley." The ceremony combined spectacle and practicality, mirroring the unique character of the venture itself. Territorial officials in formal wear stood beside Apache elders in traditional clothing. Military officers who, just months prior, might have pursued Nakoran as an outlaw, now saluted him as an official representative. Newspaper photographers recorded everything, their flashbulbs startling the Mustangs watching from a nearby corral. Governor Ellsworth, a politician with ambitions for Washington, gave a grand speech about new cooperation between America's indigenous people and its progressive government. Though his words rang hollow, the policies they embodied, secured through Dr. Grayvale's persistent advocacy and careful legal work, held enough substance to make a difference. When Silvara's turn to speak arrived, she chose to be concise and pragmatic, emphasizing the Mustangs' extraordinary adaptability and the wisdom they embodied, rather than recounting her own improbable journey. Public speaking was still a source of discomfort, but like many other obstacles she had faced in the past year, she had learned to confront it head-on. "These horses hold the knowledge of countless generations," she finished, gesturing towards the corral where Thunder Voice stood, observing the event with a dignified air, not merely in their lineage, but also in the techniques needed to work with them. Techniques that require collaboration rather than dominance, respect rather than authority. There are insights here that transcend horsemanship alone. The audience's polite applause transformed into murmurs of admiration when Nakoran illustrated these techniques, using no saddle or bridle, relying solely on subtle body language and the occasional soft word in Apache. He guided Thunder Voice through a series of movements that highlighted the stallion's intelligence and training. Horse and man operated as seamless extensions of each other, their communication almost imperceptible to onlookers, yet resulting in perfect harmony. "Enchantment," murmured one of the Eastern reporters, hurriedly jotting down notes. "Science," countered Dr. Grayvale, who had positioned herself near the press area. "Indigenous ecological knowledge, honed over centuries of observation and practice. Exactly what this center aims to record and safeguard." The formal event concluded with the presentation of the official charter, signed by the Secretary of the Interior and representatives from 3 tribal councils. Its meticulously crafted articles outlined an unparalleled agreement. Federal acknowledgement of indigenous knowledge as valuable intellectual property, tribal access to ancestral lands without relinquishing control to government bodies, and frameworks for sustainable economic endeavors that did not reduce native peoples to mere attractions or laborers. As the formalities transitioned into the more casual setting of the reception, Silvara found herself briefly alone near the refreshment tables. From this position, she could watch the various groups interacting with differing levels of ease, military officers conversing stiffly with tribal elders, Eastern journalists eagerly questioning the Apache horse trainers who would serve as instructors, and local ranchers evaluating the facilities with a competitive eye. "Quite the gathering you've orchestrated, Mrs. Riversgate," came a familiar voice. Silvara turned to see Ironright Garnetwell serving himself some punch, his expression wry but not unkind. Not entirely my creation, Ironright, she responded. Sometimes events develop a momentum of their own. Garnetwell glanced towards Nakoran, who was engaged in conversation with the governor and two tribal representatives. That's one way to look at it. 8 months ago, he was an injured fugitive, and you were a widow teetering on the brink of despair. He shook his head, astonished. Now, hosting governors and influencing federal Indian policy, it makes a man ponder what might happen next. Silvara offered a smile. I'm hoping for a much quieter summer, focused on genuine horse breeding rather than politics. The marshal's expression grew more grave. Politics never truly disappear, especially when you're questioning long-standing practices. He lowered his voice. Not everyone is thrilled about this setup. As the speeches hinted, the cavalry outpost commander sees it as rewarding troublemakers. Certain business interests in the territory view tribal economic independence as a threat. I'm aware, Silvara acknowledged, valuing his honesty. We've made preparations. Indeed, security had been a top priority in the ranch's design. The main access road was visible for miles. Apache scouts regularly patrolled the perimeter, and crucially, the hidden spring remained a closely guarded secret, known only to Silvara, Nakoran, and a few trusted individuals. Should outside water sources be compromised or access to the ranch blocked, the spring could sustain both people and horses indefinitely. Good, Garnetwell nodded. Progress often stirs up opposition. Just consider Lincoln's experience. Before Silvara could reply, Dr. Grayvale approached, her practical travel attire replaced with a more formal dress fitting for the occasion. Mrs. Riversgate, the Secretary's representative, is requesting your presence. She wants to discuss touring the training facilities. As Silvara excused herself, she overheard Garnetwell inquiring with Dr. Grayvale about the potential for similar arrangements in other territories. The physician-turned-bureaucrat's response was cautious, yet hopeful, precisely the tone they had agreed to use with officials who might either bolster or hinder their efforts, depending on political currents. The rest of the day blurred into a whirlwind of introductions, demonstrations, and meticulously planned interactions aimed at securing both governmental backing and tribal involvement. By sunset, as the last officials departed for Copper Springs, Silvara felt exhausted, yet strangely invigorated. Months of planning, negotiating, and construction had led to the official acknowledgement of a vision that had once seemed unattainable. The celebration that followed differed greatly from the formal ceremony, with the outside officials gone. The Apache families who had set up seasonal camps on the northern part of the ranch gathered around fire pits, sharing food, music, and stories. Children who had been kept away from government representatives now freely darted between the campfires, some practicing with miniature versions of the halters used for training young mustangs. Silvara sat a bit apart, observing from the porch of her new stone house. Though she had been welcomed into these gatherings, she remained mindful of her status, as an outsider granted a rare privilege. The preceding months had shown her when to engage and when to quietly observe. Are you weary of maintaining a diplomatic facade? Dr. Grayvale inquired, approaching her with 2 cups of coffee far stronger than the diluted brew offered at the reception. Silvara, weary, confessed, gratefully taking the cup. I can't fathom how you endure it day after day in Washington. Aurelia responded thoughtfully. I remind myself of the alternative, she said, her decades of navigating male-dominated institutions evident in her voice. Her medical qualifications had opened doors that remained shut to most women, and her strategic acumen kept them open despite opposition. A bit of discomfort is a small cost for making progress, she concluded. They drank their coffee in comfortable silence, observing the festivities. Across the yard, Nyra was deep in conversation with several tribal elders, his demeanor more lively than usual around white officials. Though he resided in a traditional dwelling near the horse pens, he and Silvara had forged a partnership that defied conventional labels. Not quite romantic, yet deeper than a mere professional relationship, united by shared goals and mutual respect. "Will you remain until the summer's end?" Silvara inquired. Aurelia knew her duties would soon call her back to Washington. Perhaps another week, enough time to ensure the federal funding was securely in place. And to ensure that our friend, Lieutenant Ironmere, doesn't find ways to meddle after I leave, she added with a smile. Ironmere had been reassigned rather than dismissed following the garrison investigation. A disappointment, but not a surprise. The military protected its own, and he had influential family ties in the capital. His new assignment kept him in the territory, but away from direct oversight of tribal affairs, a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but averted immediate dangers. And then, Silvara probed. Aurelia's expression softened. Then it's back to the bureaucratic battles, armed with proof that cooperation yields better outcomes than force. This center, she gestured towards the buildings and corral, will be my key example in budget hearings for years. Assuming it prospers. It already has, Aurelia countered firmly. The Mustangs were thriving. Traditional knowledge was being preserved instead of lost. Apache families had access to ancestral lands without military oversight. She placed her cup down resolutely. The rest is simply a matter of perseverance. A comfortable silence settled between them, interrupted only when one of the Apache women began a haunting melody that hushed the conversations around the fires. The song carried across the ranch, echoing off the distant hills, a sound that would have been prohibited on government reservations where traditional ceremonies were restricted, yet now rose freely into the night sky. Silvara closed her eyes, allowing the unfamiliar harmonies to envelop her. The world had shifted dramatically, not merely in the physical terrain, but in her perception of what could be achieved when desperation yielded to a clear vision. The drought that had nearly consumed her had instead compelled new alliances, new strategies, and new perspectives on the land and its inhabitants. As the melody faded, Nyra stepped onto the porch, his face thoughtful. "That was a hymn of gratitude," he said, settling down on the steps. "For rain falling on parched earth, for horses roaming freely on ancestral grounds, for vows made and honored." Aurelia inquired, "Are you content with today's results?" Ever the realist. Nyra pondered the question with his usual deliberation. Contentment implies finality. This is merely the start. He gazed towards the Mustangs, now faint silhouettes in the dusk-lit corrals. But it is a start I never imagined possible a year ago. None of us did, Silvara concurred. The Mustangs had sparked the change, but the metamorphosis reached far beyond equine husbandry. What began as a widow's urgent act of compassion had grown into a force that questioned who governed the land, whose wisdom held value, and what collaboration could look like beyond the rigid frameworks of dominance and surrender. As night fell, Aurelia retired to prepare for the next day's discussions. Silvara and Nyra stayed on the porch, their easy silence a testament to months of shared toil and political maneuvering. "You ought to join the festivities," Silvara suggested after a while, gesturing towards the bonfires where the dancing had commenced. In a moment he agreed, but first he retrieved a small item wrapped in soft hide from his vest, similar to the blade he'd gifted her months prior, for you to commemorate this day. Silvara unwrapped it gently to find a carved wooden steed, small enough to hold in her hand, yet intricately detailed. The figurine mirrored Stormwarden's unique posture, head held high, one foreleg lifted as if ready to strike the ground. "It's exquisite," she murmured, tracing the smooth contours. "Did you craft this?" Nakoran nodded. "From the juniper where you etched the gratitude symbol." His demeanor was calm, but his eyes held a deeper significance. "The elders say that to capture a creature's essence in wood is to respect its spirit, its power to transform lives. The Mustang certainly altered mine," Silvara reflected, recalling how far she had journeyed from that desperate night when she had given her sole horse to a stranger on his deathbed. "Not the Mustangs alone," Naraho murmured. "Your decision. To aid without knowing the result, to give without assurance of reciprocation." He motioned towards the ranch, the fires, the horses. All this blossomed from that instant. The remark resonated more deeply with Silvara than she had anticipated. She had made a habit of concentrating on tangible concerns: water rights, construction schedules, legal papers, breeding logs, deliberately steering clear of introspection about the profound shifts within her. However, Nakoran, in his typically forthright manner, had pinpointed the core truth. Her metamorphosis had not commenced with the Mustang's arrival, but with her own choice to prioritize kindness over practicality. "We should join them," she declared after a moment, gently placing the carving into her pocket. "This is your celebration as much as anyone else's." Nakoran stood, extending his hand with the solemn respect he reserved for pivotal moments. "Ours," he amended. "The journey ahead bears many tracks." Side by side, they moved towards the assembly, where the dancing had become more lively, the firelight stretching shadows across the ranch yard. Some of the younger Apache men had brought out drums, their beat echoing the pulse of the land itself. As they neared, the dancing briefly halted. An elder stepped forward, speaking swiftly in Apache to Nakoran, who listened attentively before replying in the same tongue. The conversation ended with nods of assent, and the elder faced Silvara. He wants to honor the woman who protected the injured wolf and gained the horse nation in return. Narcath interpreted, "It is tradition to bestow a name that mirrors one's essence." Silvara had not expected this turn of events, but she grasped its importance. Names carried weight in Apache tradition, often evolving throughout life to mirror new roles or revelations. The elder spoke once more, this time with greater formality, gesturing towards the Mustangs, the land, and finally Silvara herself. "He calls you she who unites worlds," Nakoran translated, a rare smile briefly lighting his face. "It is a fitting name, a genuine name." Around the fires, the assembled Apache repeated the name in their language, the words flowing like a river over pebbles. This was not about absorption or conquest, but about acknowledgement, recognition that diverse ways of life could coexist, that bridges could be forged where barriers had crumbled. As the drums restarted and the dancing resumed, Silvara stood at the boundary of light and darkness, keenly aware of the unseen lines she had traversed and those that lay ahead. The official agreement signed earlier that day established legal structures for collaboration, but the genuine work of cross-cultural understanding would span generations. She had not been freed from the past, so much as entrusted with a different future. Thunder Voice's unique whinny echoed from the nearby corral, as if the stallion were acknowledging the events himself. The sound resonated through the celebration, eliciting smiles and nods of acknowledgement. The Mustangs stood at the heart of this improbable alliance, living symbols of adaptability, endurance, and the untamed spirit that defied restraint. Dawn would usher in fresh obstacles: political maneuvering from the capital, local pushback against shifting power structures, and the logistical hurdles of creating breeding programs that respected traditional wisdom while addressing contemporary demands. The journey forward was uncertain and fraught with difficulties, but tonight, beneath the stars that had observed generations of human endeavor across these lands, Silvara chose to embrace the present, acknowledging that genuine freedom did not stem from a lack of limitations, but from selecting which ties to uphold. The drought that had nearly consumed her had instead uncovered hidden reservoirs of resilience. The compassion she had extended to an injured stranger had been repaid in ways she could never have foreseen. As the night enveloped the festivities, the Mustangs kept vigil from their enclosure, free yet electing to stay, their untamed insight a testament to the influence of choice in shaping captivity or freedom, solitude or companionship, mere existence or true flourishing in this unforgiving yet breathtaking terrain. If this story touched you, give it a like and tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were in their shoes? Subscribe to Frontier Stories and join us as we continue to tell stories of hope, resilience, and the beautiful, messy truth of Wild West.